Welcome to Money Talk. I'm your host, Skylar Fleming. Money Talk is a podcast where we talk about money. This podcast is a place for me to be able to share what I learn and enjoy about personal finance. Here, you'll learn something about everything from budgeting to retiring. Let's get into today's episode. Thanks for tuning into Money Talk. Today we are going to be talking about the Great Emergency Fund. There are a lot of things to learn about emergency funds. We're going to cover why you need one, when you need one, how much should you save, what do you do with your emergency fund, and so much more. Let's get into today's episode. What is an emergency fund? Do you need one? An emergency fund is just what you expect out of the name, a fund where you save for emergencies, life's unexpected expenses. We all know they happen, whether it's simple things like broken work shoes, a flat tire, or unexpected job loss. There will more than likely be a time in everyone's life where they need extra money that they can find in an emergency fund. With that being said, it is obvious that you need an emergency fund. Everyone does. There may be situations where people are comfortable without having an official emergency fund, but these are likely situations where individuals are financially independent and have a well thought out plan surrounding their money and finances. But there are far more people who are not financially independent, so I think it is safe to say that everyone needs an emergency fund. So now let's talk about when you would need to use your emergency fund and talk through some of those situations. The first reason is theft, fraud, ID theft. Let's start there for one of the many reasons why you need an emergency fund. My job at the credit union left me trying to help so many people who unfortunately found themselves victims to fraud. They were demanding that we give them their money back immediately. It left everyone in a helpless situation. The poor customer needed their money, and us on the phone couldn't do anything to help. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation where you woke up and your debit card info was stolen and your checking account balance was super low or negative? I am sure, emergency fund or not, that this would send you into a great panic. What do? How are you going to pay your bills? How are you going to get your money back? What if you need gas before work to go to work that day? Now you can't go to work. Now your paycheck may be a little bit less if you can't use paid time off. Fraud, unfortunately, sends the victims into a spiral, leaving them reaching for any help they can get. Even the terrible payday lender. Now this is one reason why you should be using a credit card if you're disciplined enough to pay it off every single month to avoid interest and fees. But then it also means that you're not out your own money. You will likely have many weeks before the credit card payment with the fraudulent charges is even due, giving the bank or credit card company plenty of time to dispute the fraud charges. But if you need an emergency fund in this situation to be able to get you through the tough times while you're waiting on the bank to fix the fraudulent charge, because you still need to be able to live your life, and life becomes all too hard when you already had very little money and then someone takes all of it. What if you get into an accident? What if there's an accident at work and you break something? Car accident? Many things could cause us harm, physically and especially financially. Imagine if you were out of a job and also had to pay unexpected expenses. These kind of situations can be incredibly hard to deal with on their own, let alone without any sort of money to help get you through the tough time. Now there are also expenses that we can certainly plan for, like car registration, tax bills, and so on, but these things sneak up on everyone now and then. But these kind of charges should not derail your financial situation. Beyond saving for them throughout the year, an emergency fund can easily help you correct the mistake and help you make a simple plan on how to avoid the issue next year when the purchase rolls around. This could also apply to subscriptions that renew yearly. If you are surprised by yearly expenses, that's a different issue that needs to be addressed. But when saving for yearly expenses throughout the year, if you come up to the charge and you're surprised, you could use an emergency fund to help you fix the issue and then create a plan. People get sick and have all sorts of unexpected health expenses, from having to get medicine that just isn't cheap to fix a simple cold or something like major medical costs. What if you get sick for a week or two and you're out of work and have no sick leave? How are you going to pay for stuff if you're living paycheck to paycheck and don't have an emergency fund? What if you and your spouse get pregnant and you weren't planning on it? Sure, you do have some time to get your stuff together and figure out how you are going to manage financially, but having an emergency fund takes this burden right off your back and makes it not so incredibly pressing. Let's talk about car issues. A flat tire really should not be an emergency. They are not that expensive, and when you have an emergency fund, you can use that money to pay for the tire. Then you can pay yourself back over the next few months instead of paying very high interest on a credit card that you had to finance the tires with. An emergency fund is crucial for little expenses like a flat tire. What are you going to do if your elderly family member passes away quicker than expected, or heaven forbid a tragic death in your family? How are you going to handle taking time off for a trip, or paying for a random trip to go to a funeral for a family member or to visit a sick family member? Dental issues come up too. What if your tooth chips or falls out? What if you break a bone? Yes, this is what insurance is for, and everyone should have insurance, but there can always be little unexpected costs that add up quickly when dealing with these type of situations. We like to take care of our pets and make sure they're okay, and sometimes they get sick or injured. This always stinks, but it is another issue where emergency funds may be helpful. How are you going to pay for a sick pet? Dealing with the stress of a sick animal is enough on our plates, let alone the money aspect of everything. The worst form of emergency is job loss. Take COVID, for example. So many people lost their job, and if they were to only have an emergency fund, their lives would have been a lot easier to manage through the tough times. The main reason that emergency funds are recommended for 3 to 6 months of expenses is so that you're able to cover the time that it may take for you to find a new job in the worst kind of emergency. I mentioned 3 to 6 months of expenses, but let's talk a little bit more about how much to save and how to figure out that amount for you for your emergency fund. There are a lot of things that can go into how much you should save for your emergency fund. The typical answer is 3 to 6 months worth of expenses. Figuring this out means that you're going to have to start tracking your expenses. Most banks and credit unions have some sort of spending tracker built in. Just looking at that can help you get a good starting point or goal to start saving for your emergency fund. But you could use websites like Personal Capital, Mint, YNAB, and there are many other options to track your expenses. You could even keep a pen and paper method or a simple spreadsheet. But there are some reasons that you may want to save more, but I don't think you should ever have less than 3 months worth of expenses. Why would you want to have more than 6 months worth of expenses? You may want to if you're planning to have a large expense coming up, or trying to take some time off in the future. What if you have a kid that has a chronic illness that you have to pay for all the time? If you were to lose your job, you have to make sure to be able to keep that kid healthy. You may also want to save more than 6 months if you work in an industry that isn't steady, or you are self-employed. Finding another job can be hard, but when you work for yourself, it can be even harder. So make sure you have at least 3 months of expenses saved up, but you don't be afraid to save up 6 months or more if you feel like it's necessary. Personal finance is definitely personal. One more thing to mention when talking about emergency funds is the sinking fund. These can be a good way to manage risk when it comes to certain categories in your budget. Do you have a car that requires a little extra work? Then budget some money each month towards it and don't spend that extra money. Then, when that few $100s comes up every few months, you won't have to go into debt for that purchase to fix your car. A sinking fund is just simply over budgeting with the intention to save for a future purchase. My wife and I do this a lot with things like subscriptions, car repair, vacations, and many other categories. It really helps when it comes to saving for those larger than normal expenses. So now that you have learned a little about and started saving for an emergency fund, where do you put it? What do you do with your emergency fund? One thing that you can do with your emergency fund is just to keep it in a simple savings or money market savings account with your local credit union. I will always generally say stay away from banks, but you could use an online high-yield savings account for your emergency fund. These are traditionally found with online banks. These new online banks are better than old-school traditional banks known for their high fees and poor service. But you need to keep your emergency fund somewhere with quick and simple access, typically a few business days to access the funds. The point of an emergency fund is to be able to get to it and use it in an emergency. So if it's tied up in all crazy ways, that defeats the purpose. Another savings account that my wife and I use is Yoda. They are a lottery-style savings account where you earn tickets for every $25 you have in your account with them. We like it because it's simple yet different. It does earn us more rewards or dividends than our regular money market savings account with our local credit union. You can sign up with my promo code SJAYF98 and we will both get 100 bonus tickets when you make a deposit. But I recommend the account and like it to anyone who asks me where they should keep some money when they have some to set aside. Now let's talk about investing your emergency fund. I know this seems strange after I just said to keep it somewhere simple and easy to access. You likely won't be looking into this option unless you're financially independent and you have plenty of money set aside and saved and invested in other ways. But if you have the ability to pay off and use credit cards wisely, this gives you plenty of options. They give you plenty of time to find the money to pay for expenses that come up unexpectedly if you put your emergency charges on a credit card. At the beginning of the month, you will probably have about 30 to 45 days before that payment is really due. This gives you time to find the money from working or time to sell your investments if you really need to, but you probably won't. Once you become more and more financially independent, you will be surprised how easily and how quickly you can come up with money in a short notice. Emergency funds are a nice safety net to have and help you rest easy at night, but you really don't need to use them all that often in general day-to-day living. Now, I do understand that there are people and situations out there that warrant the use of an emergency fund, and for those situations, go ahead and use it. I generally go towards the idea of saving money in other ways so that the emergency fund doesn't have to be used, but hey, that's why they call it personal finance. Let's talk about why the emergency fund is so key and why everyone recommends you should have one. The emergency fund is so key because it helps you sleep easy at night. It allows you not to live paycheck to paycheck and gives what everyone calls margin in your finances. It gives you the ability not to worry every 2 weeks whether your paycheck is too much or isn't enough. It helps you learn that you can save money and that you don't have to spend every penny that you get. That's why it's so key to have an emergency fund. If you don't have an emergency fund, how do you get one? How do you get started? The Dave Ramsey approach is to start by getting a $1,000 emergency fund. Now, a $1,000 emergency fund isn't going to really help you, but the point is to teach yourself that you don't need to spend every dollar and that you can save some money. So the Dave Ramsey plan helps people get started. If you don't have an emergency fund, start by setting small and simple goals for this month or the next month, just so that you can get started with saving towards your bigger and full emergency fund. So what if you have a fully funded emergency fund and you like having that cushion and savings and then boom, an emergency happens? What are you going to do if you have to use your emergency fund? Well, you need to make sure that you have a preset plan on what you're going to do with your emergency fund. The emergency fund can create more headaches if you don't have a plan on how you're going to use it. Like I said, I am someone who does not want to use the emergency fund ever, whereas my wife sees the money there for emergency and figures we should use it, which makes sense. This is something we have to communicate together and make sure we have a plan in place. The plan could look something like this. If the emergency is under $1,500, then we will not use the emergency fund immediately, but rather we will cut back our spending to find the funds for the emergency. If the emergency is over $1,500, then we will start moving money to cover the emergency from the emergency fund. Also, time should be considered. If you suffer a job loss but you know you can quickly find another job, then you may want to use some criteria like this. If I lose my job and I am not able to find a new job within 2 weeks, then I will begin to draw down my emergency funds to pay for emergency and necessary expenses. That is the other thing. When you have to use your emergency fund for job loss or in any situation, you should expect yourself to quickly cut out all your spending that is want-based, like eating out, shopping, and the other spending that is not absolutely necessary. Well, we sure did talk a lot about the Great Emergency Fund today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and gained some insights into the emergency fund. I hope you have some new ideas that you can begin to implement into your personal finance journey. Please consider subscribing and sharing this podcast with your friends. Remember to check out the show notes for important information and links. There are 2 links in there to be aware of today. One is the referral link to the Yoda savings account that I mentioned as a place to store your emergency fund. The other link is to be able to send me a voice message. I would love to be able to hear from those listening to the podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please send me a voice message and I would love to answer any questions on my show. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Money Talk.